Hello, and thanks for joining us today for a discussion of Michael Patrick Lynch's new book, which is titled On Truth in Politics: Why Democracy Demands It. The book is newly published with Princeton University Press. Before we get into the book, let's start with some introductions. I am Robert Talisse. I'm the W. Alton Jones Professor of Philosophy at Vanderbilt University in Nashville, Tennessee. My research specialization is political philosophy and democratic theory in particular. My latest book is titled Civic Solitude: Why Democracy Needs Distance. And that's enough about me. Michael Patrick Lynch is Provost Professor of the Humanities and Board of Trustees Distinguished Professor of Philosophy at the University of Connecticut in Storrs. His academic specialization is epistemology, the theory of knowledge, in other words, with emphasis on issues concerning the nature of truth. Yet his interests bring him to larger issues concerning democracy, civic discourse, the impacts of technology on society, and the ways in which the dispositions of, for example, arrogance and dogmatism can undo democracy. His roster of academic achievements is far too long for me to summarize here, but I should mention that Michael is a regular contributor beyond the academy. He's written for the New York Times, The Guardian, the Boston Review, for example, and several of his books, including the one to be discussed today, aim to be accessible to a broader audience. So, as I've mentioned, we're here to talk about that book. It's titled On Truth in Politics. Hi, Michael.
Hey, Bob.
How are you?
See you.
It's good to see you too. Let's start the conversation with the big picture, if that's okay. I suppose there's a joke in the offering. You might be used to hearing it. You've written a book about truth in politics? That'll be a short book. Um, Now, I think you do a really good job, though, in the opening of the book of making the case for the book's topic, which I think is an important thing for philosophers to do in general. Um, so, why don't you tell us a little bit about the setup, particularly about what you call the Twitbookians?
Right. Well, thanks for that. That's a joke I often tell myself, actually. Truth and politics, they mix like oil and water.
Right.
But look, the Twitbookians is a thought experiment. So I want, if you're listening, just think about it this way. Imagine a society whose political discourse is ruled by one and only one norm. Say or boast only what's liked by your friends and disliked by your enemies. That's the only thing that matters in politics to the Twitbookians. But here's the thing. The Twitbookians don't know this about themselves.
Right.
They're blind to their own rules. They tell each other that, hey, we are interested in truth. We follow the facts. I only share news stories that are vetted, that are based on evidence. But in reality, the Twitbookians actually don't care about evidence. All they care about are likes, about getting their posts viral. That's what matters to them. What I say in the book is, if you've been living the last 20 years in the United States, this should sound very familiar. And it should prompt a question. Are we like the Twitbookians? And if we are, does that mean that we are fooling ourselves when we talk about truth mattering in politics?
Right. And I take it that that concern is really the animating force behind the book, which is that it's part of the profile of the Twitbookians, as you describe them, to not realize the nature of their own discursive political practices. They think of themselves as doing their own research and as following the facts and looking at the evidence, when in fact they're motivated by quite different forces. Um, and they don't have the tools of self reflection to recognize these. To recognize the truth about themselves. And it turns out that I guess part of the picture is a little bit complicated because we're really good at recognizing others as Twitbookians. And in fact, one of the ways in which we are Twitbookian is that we tell our friends how much like the Twitbookians all of our political opposition is, not recognizing that that itself, that tendency itself, gives us some reason to suspect that we're a lot more like what we're diagnosing in others than we can see. Does that sound right to you?
It does. And it's one of the unfortunate facts about the human condition.
Good, good.
We tend to be ignorant of what really moves us. And the fact is, our society and political ideologies can contribute, not to mention our technologies, can contribute to make us more and more ignorant of our own motivations. It could cause us to become more and more Twitbookian, and less concerned about truth in politics.
Right.
And I just add one thing. One of the points of the book, as you know, is to realize, grapple straightforwardly with a kind of paradox. The paradox is politics, just by nature. That is the attempt to solve collective problems, democratically or otherwise. Politics pushes us towards Twitbookian-like behavior.
Right.
But democratic politics pushes us, I claim, towards valuing truth. And that's sort of a paradox.
Right.
Democracy tells us to value something that politics naturally tells us to ignore.
Right. And that is a real paradox at the heart of, the academic slice of the world that I work in, which is sort of in political democratic theory. This is sort of an organizing tension for a couple hundred years now. So let's unpack that a little bit more if we can, because I take it that and you lay this out, I think, very effectively in the book, that not only not only does the topic of the book call to mind the kind of joke we led with, it'll be a short book, but there's a significant sort of trend in the history of thinking, in some cases in the history of thinking that's very serious about democracy, that takes the concern with truth to be the core of a kind of anti-democratic trend. This goes all the way back, at least, to Plato. The locus classicus of this concern is Plato's Republic and some other dialogues of Plato, where it looks as if the main criticism, some would say objection, but let's say just criticism to democracy that one gets in Plato's dialogues is that democracy, on the one hand, can't care about truth because it distributes political power equally across a population without regard for the wisdom of the people who it's investing with that power. And secondly, the Platonic worry is that once you think that truth is something important for politics, you should start being very wary of democracy and start looking for ways and modes of political organization that empower the wise over the unwise or just the non-wise. Can you spell that out a little bit? That there's more than just a democracy. Politics tells us not to care about something that democracy has to care about. There's a deeper sort of like once you start caring about that thing, though, it looks like you've dipped your toe into the water of some pretty anti-democratic trends in our political thinking.
Yeah, that's definitely a concern of mine. Right now, I mean, we can even see it playing out in the public right now. It's often the case that those who scream loudest about they know what's true politically are attracted to authoritarian ideologies, are attracted to the person who says, I know, I alone can fix it because I know, as President Trump has been known to say. So there's a tendency in philosophy and in public thinking, and as it were, common sense, to think that if you're going to believe in political truth, then you've got to believe that there's somebody who knows it. And that person, this is the Platonic thought, should be the one in charge. Be it the king, the emperor, the dictator, the great leader, or the guardians, as Plato called them. So there's this long sort of association between truth and authoritarianism. And that, as just as you said, led actually many on the left, for example, to say the last thing I want to have anything to do with is the idea that there's truth in politics. Because that gives the game away to authoritarianism, to fascism, in some cases. I think that's understandable, but it's not right. It's not correct. There is a political association between authority of knowledge, knowing what you're talking about, and authority in politics. We often do fall from one to the other. We mix them up, or we say things like, well, you know, we should listen to the teacher because the teacher knows, while ignoring the fact that actually the teacher's political authority or social authority doesn't just come from the fact that they know something. It comes from the fact that they work for an institution that, people send their kids to that has been politically validated. So while there's an association between truth, knowing things, and authoritarianism, it's a mistake to equate them. And moreover, it ignores the fact, for reasons we could get into, that actually the reverse is sort of the case. Democracy is the form of government, or the form of politics, that actually requires us to be dedicated to seeking truth and knowledge and information. It's democracy, not authoritarianism, that actually celebrates truth.
Right. That's a really crucial insight that comes out very centrally in the book. And just to put some of your own detail into that, it is really difficult, it strikes me, to make good sense of some of the practices, social, cognitive, moral, and otherwise, that we routinely associate with responsible citizenship without recognizing the point that you just made, that there's something very centrally epistemic, something very centrally truth valuing about democracy. Just to give one example, it's kind of commonplace that citizens should be informed, right? That we should, understand what's going on in the world, that we should keep ourselves apprised of what our governments are doing, that our voting should be driven by certain kinds of information and concerns and not driven by others. This is why, for example, I take it to be a pretty commonplace democratic attitude that, there's something unsavory about a person selling her vote, right? It's like, money is not the right kind of thing that should determine how you cast your ballot. Well, what is the right kind of thing? Well, it looks like it's stuff like information, evidence, reasons. It's and we haven't even gotten into the role that political discourse and discussion and even disagreement plays. It's very hard to make sense of any of this catalog of activities without eventually having to bring into the picture concerns about what makes a belief or a judgment or an assertion correct or incorrect. And it's very hard to make sense of correctness in these matters without starting to talk about evidence and reasons. And then eventually, and by eventually, I mean, it's a very short move eventually to talking about truth. So I guess then that the real task that the book is, the needle that the book is trying to thread is how to spell out the distinctively democratic concern with truth and the other concepts in its neighborhood without inviting the traditional Platonic implication. Does that sound right to you?
Yes, it does. And I think, of course, you're right that basic democratic values that all of us agree are democratic values. Values, for example, like an informed public. Values like speaking truth to power. That is social criticism. I mean, truth is right there in the famous civil rights slogan, speaking truth to power. Being able to articulate what you think is the case against those who have the power in the society. And moreover, we think that those in power, our elected representatives, have an obligation to give us reasons and evidence for why they're engaging in the policies they're engaging in. They needed to speak truth back to us, or at least attempt to do so. These are values. Obviously, like all values, they're not often realized. And right now in our society, they're not realized at all.
Right.
In part because, over the last couple of months, we've seen an erosion of the institutions that protect those values. Right. But it's not coincidental either to the book or to our political situation that there's also been an erosion and a deliberate attack on those institutions whose job it is to gather evidence, to gather data, to engage in fact-finding, the media, the law, and higher education, both higher education and public education.
Right.
The fact that authoritarians target these institutions is no news to historians. But it still makes a philosophical point that is absolutely essential for us all to remember right now. That is, authoritarians fear the truth, fear the institutions that seek it, because they know that truth is a central democratic value.
Good. That strikes me as one of the powerful upshots of the book and some of your writing since the publication of the book. And I think that it enables us to draw, I think, a really nice contrast between the democratic way in which truth enters into our inventory in our thinking about politics and the Platonic way. Let me just lay this out and see what you think. Because I think that this is also part of the diagnostic story of where we are at today in the United States, where the concern for truth, I think in Plato and today, has been disconnected, it seems to me, from valuing the processes by which we seek it. Where in the traditional Platonic story, the guardian, the philosopher king, doesn't have to seek truth. He knows, right? He knows. In our contemporary politics, a lot of what I think you and I, at the very least, and maybe a lot of the people who'll be listening to us, recognize as a kind of dysfunctional concern with truth is the I alone can fix it kind of stance, or the we've deported a guy without following any of the due process reasons, but he was a bad guy, right? That the idea that the process of discerning, determining, looking at the evidence, weighing it, these cognitive processes by which truth is valued because it's pursued in the right way have been undermined or short circuited or deemed to be irrelevant. Whereas it looks like part of your argument now that separates, that distinguishes your view from the traditional Platonic view is that truth enters into the democratic catalog by way, and the value of truth enters by way of valuing the processes by which we seek it. Does that sound right?
That's exactly right. Process is essential component of democratic life for just the reasons you articulated. John Dewey celebrated this thought, claiming in a famous essay that democracy is radical.
Right.
And what's radical about it is democracy doesn't say, look, liberty is important. Well, it says that, but not just that. Equality is important. It says that, but not just that. What it says is, it also matters how we achieve those ends. We can't just, it's not democratic. It's just to hand the keys to the state over to a leader who says, don't worry, I'll make everybody equal. I'll make everybody, in a just situation. Democracy says it matters how we get there. Switch different analogy. Democracy says it's not just about getting to the top of the mountain, where the mountain is towards the mountain of justice. It's what matters in part is our climbing, our pursuit. Same with truth. The democratic value of truth lies in its pursuit. That's why, at the end of the day, democracies must protect and promote what I call in the book, following political scientist Lisa Herzog, our epistemic infrastructure. Epistemic meaning having to do with knowledge, infrastructure, like those things I've mentioned already, the media, the court system, science, higher ed in general, and of course, secondary education. This is infrastructure for democracy, just like roads and bridges, just like the healthcare system. If you allow it to wither, or allow it to be pushed aside by those who claim, as you put it, I already know the truth, so I don't need to seek it, you are abandoning democracy. It's as simple as that.
Right. I like the point that you just emphasized in your remarks, because it strikes me as as a real central insight, not merely of John Dewey, but of pragmatism in general. The point that method is really important. How you got there is really, means are really important. In fact, you know, a good Deweyan theme is that sort of means help determine the character of the end, even, right? Sort of hard to say what the end is unless you sort of import information about the means. I'm on board with a lot of that because of some philosophical commitments I have that are not relevant right now that I think we both share. So let me get into a little bit of some of the more nitty gritty of the book because as I mentioned in the introduction, you know, your straightforwardly academic work is pretty academic, if we could call it that way. You know, mine too. You know, we're trained philosophers and we work in some pretty central areas of philosophy. But I did want to draw out one particular distinction that comes up pretty early in the book as part of the setup for the way that the analysis is going to proceed, which I think is very important. Because when we're thinking about truth and when you're trying to make the case that, you know, as democratic citizens, it's part of the commitment to being a Democrat in the laudatory sense that you think that our collective decisions answer to some such concept as truth, manifested in the way that you lay out. But any talk about truth is going to almost instantly embroil us in a couple of different philosophical issues that turn out to be really thorny. And I want to lay out two of them and then ask you to speak to a distinction that you draw. So, you know, once we're thinking that, you know, truth is a thing, we have to make some decisions about what are the primary vehicles that can be assessed as true or false. Are they statements that occur at a particular time by a particular speaker? Are they the propositions, the linguistic entities that are expressed in statements? Are they beliefs? You know, the attitudes that we have towards propositions. And you know these debates, and maybe one or two of our listeners might know how complicated this gets very quickly. But however we address that kind of question, what sort of item is the truth apt item in the first instance? We are going to have to start talking very quickly about meanings or about semantics, what those items, sentences, statements, assertions, beliefs, what the meaning is. And this is why I take it in the beginning of the book, you make this distinction between what we might think of as meaning in the sort of very technical sense that we might call semantic meaning, right? The cat is on the mat means, and then we can point to something maybe. And what you call political meaning, which is something quite different, which I think, given what you've already said about the Twitbookians, these are people who think they're doing one thing and respecting one set of norms, when in fact, unbeknownst to them, they're respecting another set of norms, where that other set of norms, the, you know, delight your friends and enrage your enemies norms, look like they're talking about meaning in this other kind of sense, not semantic meaning, but political meaning. Can you just lay out the distinction for us?
Let's just first talk about political meaning.
Good.
It's a pretty intuitive idea. We all know right now in our lives that every freaking thing carries with it some political symbolism. The coffee we drink, the cars we drive, right? And the things we say. Political meaning are the symbolic associations we attach to everything. I mean, George Orwell said, everything becomes political. And right now, our life in the United States and elsewhere in the world illustrates that. Even the weather is political now.
Apparently.
And that's something that sometimes we're very sensitive to in our lives. Sometimes we forget about. And that's easiest to do when it comes to speech and our thoughts, our beliefs. Even our beliefs can have political associations. Now, those political associations are not determined by us. When I say something in a context like this, what I'm saying, the examples I use, will have a political meaning to the listeners. Different political meanings to different listeners. Because political meaning, political is all about perception. It's how we perceive the object or the speech act or the person in the context at hand. So, take a red hat. There's a certain type of red baseball cap that in our country, even that color of red on a baseball cap carries with it immense political meaning. Some positive associations for some, very negative associations for others. And why does all this matter? Because, look, take a claim like climate change is a hoax. That claim has a literal meaning. Its literal meaning is climate change is a hoax. Not complicated. But its political meaning, its political associations could be much richer and deeper. It could be the case, for example, that someone who says that claim, says political climate change is a hoax, may not actually really believe it or disbelieve it. They may just say it because they know that it has the right political meaning for their own tribe. They'll share it on social media because it symbolically says, hey, I'm on your team. I'm on the anti-climate science team. I'm on the own the libs team. So a lot of our political speech that we make is motivated by political meaning. And when we're doing that, we're like the Twitbookians. So part of the goal of democracy is to try to get us to be sensitive to that, to engage in the rule, follow the rules of those institutions that are called our epistemic infrastructure, that try to get us to pay attention to the evidence, not just the political meaning. It's easier said than done, fortunately.
Right. So I take it then that, and that sounds totally compelling to me, the data here, some of which you lay out, but pretty extraordinary about, even the way that certain words get pronounced has political meaning in the way that you just laid out. In fact, it's a pretty good indicator of the partisan leanings of a speaker to pay attention to how they pronounce the names of certain foreign countries, right? Iran versus Iran is a really
Right.
good indicator of the partisan allegiance of a speaker. And I don't even have to lay out, how that shakes down, right? How that shakes out. We know who says Iraq and who says Iraq. Um, but I guess that one sort of way of expressing the kind of concern about the epistemic infrastructure that you're laying out in the book that I don't think gets expressed exactly in this way in the book, but I'm curious to see if you would endorse it, is that the extent to which political meanings have infiltrated and overtaken all of the dealings that we would have with meaning in the more ordinary sense, such that it's now very easy to find polling where significant numbers of the country assert that egg prices are down when it's very hard to interpret them as believing that in the ordinary sense of belief, um, or that the economy is better, where again, there's no indicator of a reliable sort that suggests that. All the ordinary indicators that people are responsive to, like gas prices, suggest the opposite. Looks as if that's one way of just sort of that's one really potent sight of the way in which the infrastructure is being attacked. Political meaning has become the dominant sort of the dominant mode to understand political assertions, and is in fact has supplanted, overcome semantic meaning. Does that sound right to you?
It does. And in the book, well, you put it, I think, in a very illuminating way. What I say is, when political meaning becomes all that we care about, we're talking ourselves out of democracy.
Good, good. No.
So what we just need to do is try to figure out how to counter that.
Right.
And the recipe for it really has got to come from a couple different sources, none of which are shocking. That's the thing. The ways in which we fix our problems, the recipes for solving these problems, are not shocking to hear. We know what they are. The hard part is motivating ourselves to follow those recipes. Those recipes include realizing that social media is a political meaning machine. What it does is it memifies political discourse. Memes are literal machines for driving, articulating, and creating political meaning, political associations, for good and for bad. But if we don't start paying attention to the fact that our political discourse has been entirely by its memification, and take steps to, among other things, get phones out of the classrooms, out of the hands of kids while they're trying to learn. We are just continuing to nail our coffin shut on democracy. On top of that, attacking universities, as I said, is a time-honored way of authoritarians to assert control over the truth, or what's asked for truth. We need to protect our higher institutions of higher learning. We have, in ways that didn't happen in Turkey, didn't happen in Hungary. Again, that will come not as a shock to most of the people listening who value truth and knowledge. But we need to realize that the two things I mentioned are not separate. I'll leave it. Let me just end with this thought and this train of argument. It's not a coincidence that Donald Trump's social media platform is called Truth Social.
Yeah. No.
So,
yeah. So let me ask one, maybe this is a philosopher's question, but I think it's okay nonetheless.
questions are okay.
Um, one disturbing observation, at least one that's been disturbing to me, is how in the past decade or so, maybe it's been longer, the vocabulary of that are the vocabulary that's in the neighborhood of truth and evidence and looking and researching and not being deferential to inappropriate authorities, that's become more and more central to our politics. Again, the I do my own research, don't be a sheep, all of that stuff that is pretty recent vintage, at least as a central part of how we conduct democratic politics in the United States. It seems to me that that's occurred alongside that has occurred in the absence of a corresponding concern for the nature of evidence, reasons, truth, right? Routine updating of one's beliefs in terms of evidence and so on. That it looks like as these concepts have become more and more central to how we conduct our politics, clear thinking about what those concepts really come to has sort of fallen by the wayside. So it's not uncommon to for people who talk about following the research or doing their own research or following the science for real, to not have much of an answer when you ask them, well, what's your view of evidence? As sometimes we philosophers ask people, like, you're saying there's all this evidence against, climate change. What do you think evidence is? Not what the evidence is. I'm asking you a philosophical question. What is evidence? Seems like you got to have a view about that. Now, I take it that your book is trying to lay out in a way that non-philosophers might be able to digest some pretty detailed philosophical accounts of what these words that we now are pretty central to our conducting of democratic politics, what these words mean in a way that makes them consistent with democracy and not inviting of the Platonic challenge. Does that sound right to you, that that's part of the aim of the book, is to bring some nuance into our understanding of the concepts that we are already deploying?
Yes, that's very much why I begin with the Twitbookians.
Right.
Remember, the Twitbookians are convinced that they follow the evidence. They do their own research. They think that they're being good, democratic, and epistemic citizens. Look, it's also the case that the words like evidence and truth, as we've already talked about, have their own political meanings. So that makes it the case that the word evidence itself has different political nuance to people. So one thing to think about here is that for a lot of people right now, they not only have a particular view, political view of what evidence is, they're encouraged to have it. What do I mean? Well, for a lot of people, to go get the evidence means find out what people are saying on TikTok or on Fox News. After all, we have a president who says things routinely like a lot of people are saying. He sees that as evidence. But that's not what we mean by evidence in science. It's not what we mean by evidence in the courtroom. And it's a good thing, too.
Yeah. Right. So there's a lot of detail in the book that we're just not going to be able to get into, right? Including what, for readers like me, a very really impressive, I should say, Michael, sort of appendix about what we might think of as the semantic theory for your conception of political truth. There's a lot of very compelling philosophical work done about the multiply realizability of truth and the different properties that truth might be, that might fill the truth role. And, But I do want to make sure that in the time that we have left, I want to talk about the very end of the book. Um, because there, once again, I think that your view can be distinguished insightfully from the Platonic view, in that you're concerned to say, no, democracy sees truth as a value because it sees truth seeking and the processes by which we ascertain the better and the worse from the point of view of truth as values. But that entire system, the infrastructure, as you put it, following Herzog, right, can be corrupted, right? The Platonic view is just that democracy is epistemically inept and corrupt, right? And Socrates says in the Crito, democracy only can do things haphazardly,
Yeah.
right? So you want to talk about corruption of the epistemic system that democracy depends on. And there you sort of talk about bald-faced lies as one side of corruption, arrogance as another side of corruption. And then you end the book with some notes about why there still, despite all of this, might be grounds for hope. Can you tell us a little bit about those themes that come up at the end?
Yeah. So, one that's particularly relevant right now is the phenomenon of bald-faced lies in politics. These aren't just simple stretching the truth that all politicians engage in, all people engage in. These are the sorts of saying black is white, saying up is down, sort of lies that we've all become all too familiar with. Egg prices are down, said while loading a carton of eggs, which is, $6, $7.
Right. Or that Ukraine started the war with Russia.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Ukraine started the war with Russia. That's obviously false. What is the point of these lies? Is it to deceive? Well, obviously, they will deceive some people. You can say almost anything. Some people believe it. But that's not their function. Their function is really more insidious. After all, if a politician or a government really wants to convince lots of people of something, there's better ways to do it than just say things that are obviously false. Propaganda, for example. The point of these lies is to express contempt for the rules of evidence. It's to say, look, I know you know, I know that you know that I know this is false, but I'm going to assert it. And if I can, make you go along with it. Act as if it's true. It's as if, a ball player is tagged out in a baseball game and then insists that they're not out. Well, what happens if the ball player owns the field? He might be able to compel the referees to look away.
Right.
That's what these lies are doing. And that corrupts the rules. Because think about the analogy. The ball player owns the game, owns the field. People look away. What's the other team do? Well, maybe the other team starts abandoning the rules too.
Right.
So, I think this is a main source of corruption right now. It's not the only one, but it's a big one.
And you think arrogance is connected to that? It seems that there is
Yeah.
your account of the big bald-faced lie and the arrogant, the my gut is a more reliable source of 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 evidence and truth than anything that you know people in universities with labs might be able to discern. Is that part of the story too?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Arrogance. Look, we're both eggheads. You look up arrogant in the dictionary and you see my picture, as I'm sure a lot of people will be thinking. Arrogance is on the left and the right. But it's a corrupting influence on democratic politics.
Right.
Because when you think you know everything, you don't bother to seek the truth. The problem is arrogance can be built into an ideology. And it generally is. Authoritarian ideologies weaponize it. They always have.
Right.
So another way to combat these things, the hope that we talked about,
Good.
really lies in first being aware of these simple distinctions, being aware of political meaning, being aware of our Twitbookian tendencies, being aware that ideologies can weaponize arrogance, but also being aware that there are means that democracies have, old means, to combat these tendencies. Those means are found in the norms and the rules of epistemic infrastructure. We've got to throw our shoulder behind that infrastructure now. Especially now. Especially now. That's the hope that these rules and norms actually are there to correct for what Kant called our human crooked timber, the crooked timber of humanity. The houses of humanity are built with that crooked timber. But our rules, our infrastructure can help us compensate for that. Make us less arrogant, more democratic. That's the
Great. And one last thing before we go, and do you find it as a sort of grounding for the hope that you just laid out? Because I think it's very important when we're writing books about democracy to not be doomers um, for pragmatic reasons. I think they're self-fulfilling prophecy worries.
yes.
But do you think that part of the grounding of the hope that you just laid out lies in the fact that what we're seeing in these dysfunctions is a kind of corrupting that claims to be upholding the right norms, right? It's not like people are saying, I don't care about the rules. They're saying, no, the rules are actually working in this way. It's not that I don't care about truth. Nobody's saying that. They're saying, no, this is what is true. Here's what the evidence really shows, so that the corruption has a kind of what we might think of in sort of the Jason Stanley sense. It sort of appeals to the right norm as the way of undermining it. Is that sort of, I mean, it would be much worse if the social media arm of MAGA weren't called truth, it seems to me. Does that sound right?
Exactly. Yes. That's exactly why I brought that example up.
Right.
The enemies of democracy have historically claimed to be representing democracy.
Right.
The enemies of knowledge, of truth, always claim to be speaking in its name. And the fact that we've now got to a point where a chief organ of disinformation is called truth speaks to that. After all, what was the name of the main paper of the Soviet Union? Pravda.
Yeah.
Truth. That is a warning. It's not a subtle warning. It's so unsubtle that people are apt to laugh it off, to not realize how serious it is.
Right.
It's very serious. We've got to realize that the enemies of democracy will use its ideals to corrupt it, as Jason Stanley has indeed famously pointed out, as Goebbels famously pointed out. But that should also encourage us, as I said, to realize that we already have the means in front of us. It's right there. We do know better ways to achieve truth. We do have a better conception of evidence than whatever people are saying on TikTok. We have the scientific method. We have historical archives. We have experts trained in these things. And we have our own human integrity. Let's not lose sight of that fact. Humans may often be tempted to be Twitbookians, be tempted to ignore what's true and false in favor of political meaning. But we all have the power to ignore that temptation and do the difficult thing of actually engaging in real inquiry. That's the hope that I think maybe we should leave people with.
That is a really nice place to end. It reflects very closely the ending of the book, which is deeply inspiring. Michael, thanks for talking today, and congratulations on the publication of On Truth and Politics. It's a really fabulous book.
Thank you so much, Bob.